Which are the best, fastest road clinchers on the market? And honestly, is there really any difference between tires? To find out, we sent 10 pairs of tires to Wheel Energy, which is an independent lab in Finland. Then to correlate that lab data with the real world, I did scores of tests outside here in Colorado. Let's start with the lab.
Wheel Energy is an independent lab that works entirely with tires. While they do a lot of testing for various brands like Michelin and Specialized, they aren't involved in tire development for any brand. Point is, they're a neutral third party. For BikeRadar, Wheel Energy tested 10 tires on a smooth drum, and then again on a rough surface drum to replicate a normal road surface. For each model, they tested a pair of tires, and then averaged the results. The tires were tested at 40k an hour with a 50k load. For my fellow Americans, that's roughly 25 miles an hour with a 110-pound load. The tires tested were Bontrager R4, Zip Tangente Speed, Schwalbe Pro 1 Tubeless, Clement LCV, Michelin Power Competition, Vittoria Competition Corsa, Hutchinson Fusion 5 Galactic, and Specialized S-Works Turbo Cotton and S-Works Turbo Tubeless. Wheel Energy takes great pains to standardize everything. The tires are all acclimatized for 24 hours, and when installed on the wheel, they are warmed up on a small drum that wears out factory protective compounds like silica. Once the tire is mounted on the test device, tire pressure is checked, 2 measurements are taken during the test, and then tire pressure is again checked after the test. For our purposes, Wheel Energy measured each of the tire models at 8 bar, or 116 psi, and calculated the rolling resistance in watts. The next test was to see how much of a difference air pressure can make. So, Wheel Energy took the best performing tire from the previous tests. Spoiler alert, that would be the Schwalbe Pro 1 Tubeless, along with the best and worst performing clinchers, and they measured rolling resistance across a range of different air pressures. For each tire, they tested resistance at 10 psi increments, from 70 up to 120 psi. Now, the plan was to test all 25mm tires for an apples-to-apples comparison, and for the most part we did that. But Specialized doesn't make 25s, they only do a 24 and a 26, so we tested one of each and averaged those. In the process, we also got to compare the effect of tire width on the speed of otherwise identical tires. It has been demonstrated before that wider tires can be faster, and we found that to be true again here. We also tested Zip 28mm tires as well as the 25s, just for comparison. Finally, Vittoria accidentally sent 23mm tires instead of 25s, so you can see how a very good but thinner tire adds up. Here's how the tires did on the smooth drum. You can see that a tubeless tire wins the day here. Schwalbe's Pro 1 creates just 20.9 watts of resistance. Michelin has talked a big game about its new power tires, and this test backed up that talk. It was the fastest clincher. And the Zips, the Bontrager, the Specialized, and Continental are not far behind. Because roads are not perfectly flat, Wheel Energy's test drums are intentionally not completely spherical. And to replicate actual roads, Wheel Energy also has a rough surface non-spherical drum. As you might expect, the rougher the road, the more resistance there is. Now this rough surface test is more applicable to the real world than the smooth drum, but the order of the results was roughly similar, with the top 3 tires and the bottom 2 coming out in the same order. I found it interesting how some tires improved relative to others when going from the smooth to the rough drum. The Continental, for instance, jumped from 9th to 5th. Personally, I put more stock in the rough surface test than the smooth drum, because the rough drum shows how tires have to deal with small but constant bumps, just like you do when riding tarmac. Like tests done by others in the past, we found wider to be better. The Zip 28mm tires were faster than the Zip 25s. The Specialized 26s were faster than the 24s. All the tires were tested on the same Easton EC90 SL wheel, which has a generous 19mm internal width. This gives each tire a boost in cross-section and thus speed when compared to the same tire on a narrower rim. All the clinchers were tested with an 88-gram butyl tube, and the tubeless tires were tested with 25 milliliters of sealant, which adds about 54 grams to the weight. To see all the detailed results, including weights, prices, and measured widths, as well as the rolling resistance numbers, head over to the story on BikeRadar.com. Click the link on the screen now if you're tired of listening to me, or you can click the same link at the end of this video. Okay, so you can measure differences in the lab. Great, but does that mean anything in the real world? I tried to find out here in Colorado. First, I tried dozens of roll-down tests, starting at 20 miles an hour and coasting for 200 meters. While I could see some trends and a difference for the best and the worst tires, it was impossible to completely isolate all the other factors that go into speed to make any real solid conclusions. I tried roll-down tests starting from 10 miles an hour, which is roughly the tipping point at which rolling resistance becomes a greater influence on speed than aero drag. Again, I could see some trends for the outliers, but turns out I'm not a machine, nor is the real world a laboratory. To completely eliminate aero drag from the equation, I did 10-mile tests on my rollers. There I could definitely see some repeatable differences. The tires performed in the same order as they did in the lab test. The Schwalbe Pro 1 was the fastest. The Clement LCV was the slowest. I rode as close to 200 watts as I could for each test. Usually I'd average between 195 and 199. On the rollers, I found a 3-minute spread between the best and the worst, ranging from less than 19 minutes for the Pro 1 to more than 22 minutes for the Clement. But keep in mind, these roller tests greatly exaggerate the impact of rolling resistance. Now air pressure, as you might expect, made a huge difference. Going from 120 psi to 70 psi added more than 2 minutes on this 10-mile test for each tire. These findings track pretty well with Wheel Energy's progressive air pressure tests. As you can see, more pressure equals less resistance. As before, the pressure test used a 50 kilogram load and a 40 kph wheel speed. For most riders, who, along with their bike, weigh less than 100 kilograms, the wattage cost would be less. Similarly, the slower you go, the less resistance there is. The road surface test shows the same trend. Now, the specificity of testing is a double-edged sword. On one hand, the scientific repeatability is great. On the other, by nature of being very specific, we can't replicate the full range of road conditions you experience. Still, this lab testing provides a great baseline for how the tires perform relative to one another. Another thing to remember is the dynamics of resistance when you're on the bike. At 10 miles an hour or less, rolling resistance is the primary force to overcome. As your speed increases, rolling resistance goes up, but in a linear fashion. Above that 10 mile an hour threshold, aero drag becomes your biggest obstacle. And unlike rolling resistance, it ramps up exponentially the faster you go. All that to say, when you're riding quickly, it is all but impossible to feel rolling resistance. If you're interested in seeing how rolling and aero resistance affect you, check out the interactive chart at gribble.org. There, you can enter your weight and slide the cursor to see how much power is required at a given speed, and how much of that power is going to your tires versus the air. It's a pretty cool little tool. Finally, I did a series of climbing tests where the average speed was under that 10 mile an hour threshold, and thus aero influence was low. I rode as close to 250 watts as possible in the same position, in the same clothing, in back-to-back runs up Lower Flagstaff here in Colorado. It's a 2.8 mile stretch that averages 7%. Here, where the rubber meets the actual road, the time differences were quite small. The Continental and the Bontrager, for instance, were 5 seconds apart on a 21-minute effort. Back-to-back tests on the Michelin Power, both at 243 watts average, produced a 6-second difference. So, among the best tires, environmental factors could easily play more of a difference than that half of a watt of lab-measured rolling resistance. Now, running the best and worst tires back-to-back displayed a wider difference. I found a 16-second split between the Schwalbe and the Clement. Experimenting with air pressure made a noticeable difference. The Bontrager, for instance, was 20 seconds slower on average across multiple tests when I rode it at 70 psi than when I rode it at 120 psi. While the environmental factors were much more substantial and impossible to completely isolate, the overall trends from the lab and the roller testing held. More rolling resistance equals a slower time at the same power. But in the real world, I found those speed differences between the very best tires at the same pressures all but impossible to discern.
So what are the takeaways here? Well, we saw in the lab that among the best tires, there are small but measurable differences. We saw that wider tires, up to a point, are generally better tires in terms of speed and comfort. We saw that when you decrease your air pressure, you increase your rolling resistance. And that holds true both in the lab on a smooth surface and out on normal roads. Finally, one thing that the lab didn't show, but you probably already know, is that decreasing your air increases your comfort and often your grip. So like anything in cycling, it's a balance. For me, I have a few takeaways. One, I'll keep riding my tires at about 80 to 100 PSI. I can't feel 2 or 3 watts difference, but I can feel the difference in comfort you get when you drop about 20 PSI out of your tires. 2, for racing, I'll still pump my tires up to about 110, 115. On a good tire, it still feels pretty comfortable, and we know it's faster. And 3, I don't think I will ever buy a 23 mil tire again.